Okay, thank you all for joining us. A good evening. I hope everyone's feeling well. This is the 7th class of what happened at Sinai. Don't worry if you missed any of the previous ones. Each one's different. Each one's new. We will refer to some of the things we talked about, but try to review them as we go back. So as promised, we've talked a lot about the events, what happened, so to speak, at Sinai, and not as much about what was specifically said, the 10 Commandments themselves. And that's where that's the next unit. So we're going to start that tonight. We're going to jump right in. And I'm going to remind you that we spoke about the discussion, somewhat of a debate as to what did the Jewish people hear from God at Sinai? We know we experienced prophecy. All our ancestors all heard God speak. What did they hear God say? Did they hear all 10 commandments from God? Did they hear just the first 2? Did they hear all 10 but didn't really understand them and only understood the first 2 directly? Moses had to explain the rest. So it's clear from the Talmud that the rabbis, the sages of the Talmud, understood that they only at least understood clearly the first 2 commandments from God. There's a statement in the Talmud as follows in Makos. It says, sorry, I'm just gonna mute everyone. I forgot to do that. Feel free to unmute to ask questions, etc., or comment. It says in the Talmud, I am the Lord your God, and you shall have no other gods, which are the first 2 of the 10 commandments. It says there, the first 2 we heard from the mouth of the Almighty. It's in the context of another discussion. We might get into that discussion later, but that's what it says in the Talmud. So that's what we're going to be working with tonight, that assumption that these were the 2 commandments that the Jewish people heard and understood directly from God. And the question would be, why these 2? Of all the, I mean, they're the first ones, but what makes them the first? And one of the great medieval commentators, the Rabbi Nissim, shares with us that these 2 statements were singled out for they are foundations of Torah. They are foundations of our belief system, the belief in God, and the prohibition of idolatry. These 2 cornerstones are eternal and cannot be deferred even temporarily. So the implication is that some of the other commandments could be deferred temporarily, but these cannot. And the idea is something that we call in Hebrew a hora'at sha'ah, which is like a temporary ruling or temporary teaching, which means that under certain circumstances, the rabbis or a prophet at least can come along and tell us that at least at this moment, there's a certain commandment that we shouldn't keep right now or don't have to keep. There would have to be very good reason or have to be a prophecy to say that, but there's such a concept. But what the Talmud says is that it doesn't apply to these first 2 commandments. The Talmud says as follows. It says that Rabbi Abba says, that Rabbi Yochanan says, with regard to all mitzvot, with regard to all commandments, if a prophet will say to you, violate matters of Torah on a provisional basis, meaning temporarily, heed him. If he's a prophet, if he's proven himself to be a true prophet, and he tells you that God told me that right now there's one commandment that is not to be observed. Again, we're not going to start throwing them out, but there may be times in history where that's appropriate. And so you have to heed him. If he's a prophet and he's proving himself to be a prophet, then heed him, except for idol worship. As even if he establishes that he is a bona fide prophet and stops the sun for you in the middle of the sky, so he's somehow, he's performing miracles and wonders and he looks like the real deal, but do not heed him. If he's telling you to go worship other gods, then he's gotta be a phony. He's not someone who you should listen to. So if he's proven, it seems to have proven himself, and he tells you that at this moment in time, there's a certain commandment that we are not to heed. So, and it's always only could be on a temporary basis. but for something that comes up, we shouldn't heed a certain commandment. Okay, we could trust him. But if he says, let's go worship some idol or some other god, or there is no God or something like that, so then don't heed him. So what Rabbi Onisim is saying, the Ran is telling us that's why these two commandments are singled out. Those are the eternal, never ever can be broken, even temporarily commandments. That I am the Lord your God, which we'll have to talk about how that is a commandment. It doesn't sound like a commandment, it sounds like a statement. And secondly, you shall have no other gods, don't worship idols, etc. These are eternal. They cannot even be, they will never be broken even temporarily. Now, one of the things that we're going to keep coming back to, well, as we discuss the commandments, is a fascinating idea, which is that if we look at our chart of the 10 commandments, there are different patterns within the 10 commandments. So last time, for example, we pointed out, Rav Hirsch said this idea, others also said this idea, that basically, if you look at it, so on the right side, my right at least, what you see on the right side of your screen, you have, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods is number 2, which includes don't make idols, etc., don't worship idols. Number 3 is don't swear falsely by the name of God. Number 4 is to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, to observe Sabbath, the Shabbos. Number 5 is honor your father and your mother. So those are the first 5. And the next 5, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. So what jumps out at us immediately, or should, is that these 5 are between us and our fellow man. They're interpersonal. And these 5, except for maybe the 5th, which is a question, but are between us and God. To believe in God, to not worship other gods, to not swear falsely by the name of God, to keep Shabbat. These are all between us and God, and these are all between us and other men. So that's one pattern that jumps out. Last week we mentioned that if you look at the mitzvos, the commandments between us and God, so they start in the mind and then they go to action. So it starts with belief and then it moves to speech. Don't swear falsely. Believe in God, don't have other gods. Then it moves to speech. Don't swear falsely by the name of God. Then it moves to action, which is the positive actions of Shabbat, like making kiddush or refraining from certain actions, controlling our actions on Shabbos, and finally honoring your father and mother also in action. But on the other side, it goes from action to thought. It starts with don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, which are all actions. And then it moves to speech. Don't bear false witness against your neighbor. That's speech. And then it goes to the mind. You shall not covet. And we mentioned last week that the idea is when it comes to our relationship with God, we might be tempted to say that what God really cares about is just what's in our heart. That we believe in him, and it's all about the heart. And does God really care what I do, what I say? We might be tempted to say that he doesn't care. So the 10 commandments say otherwise. It says not only do God's commandments and our relationship with God, should it regulate our thoughts, our beliefs, but it should carry into the way that we speak, and not only to the way that we speak, but even the way that we act, that our belief in God, our connection to God should regulate our behavior through and through. And with the interpersonal, we might think the opposite. We would say, what really matters is our actions. Does it really care what I say or what I think about others? Does that really affect them? So the Torah tells us that it does make a difference. So not only do we have to control our acts towards others, but we have to control the way that we speak with regards to others, and we have to control and regulate even our thoughts about others and their possessions and not coveting. So as we do each commandment, we'll discuss them each more in depth. But so that's another pattern. But the pattern that I really wanted to mention now is the across pattern, which the Midrash points out that going across each of the commandments between man and God is somehow related to the commandment, the interpersonal commandment that's across from it. So I am the Lord your God is going to relate somehow to you shall not murder, and not having other gods relates to not committing adultery. Now that kind of makes sense, right? It's saying don't commit adultery with God, don't worship other idols, don't worship other gods, and don't be faithful in your relationships with others, with spouses, and generally, the idea of being faithful to relationships. And as we go through, we'll talk about each one as we get to it, but not this week. But there is a pattern. So what we're going to do now is look at primarily the top two. We'll touch on the next ones, but I just want to bring out one point which relates to what we started with. We started with the point that the first two commandments are the commandments that we heard from God. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods besides me, and everything that goes with that. And we're now saying that these actually correspond to the ones across from them. How does I am the Lord your God relate to you shall not murder? So the most basic idea is that the idea that the sanctity of human life comes from the neshama, from the soul, and the godliness that we see in each life. And it's not just the utility of a person, and when a person isn't useful to society, then we can dispose of them. We don't need them anymore. They're not contributing. So what's the point of their existence? No, Judaism ascribes sanctity to every human life, and that's regardless of whether how much of a contributor they are to our society and to the greater good. We value every human life, and where does that come from? Where does that tremendous value that we give come from? It's because we see that each human life is endowed with a godly soul. Each human life has godliness in them. So I am the Lord your God, to believe in God and to believe in people, to believe in the sanctity of people, because they have the spark of a godly soul in them. And not only that, the other idea is that just as when we say to believe in God, I am the Lord your God, we're saying don't discount God's existence. And the same is true with people. Don't discount other people's existence. Certainly, don't murder. That's the highest level of that. But even on a more basic level, acknowledge people's existence. Treat them well. And that comes from the idea that we see godliness in them. We believe in each person. So we're going to focus not so much on number 6 today. We're going to focus more on number 1. But what we can now bring out is a very important idea, which is, now that we've said that we heard numbers 1 and 2 directly from God, and number 6 and 7 are sort of the same idea. They correlate to them just between us and each other interpersonally. Now, does anybody know what these 3 commandments all have in common, let's say, or these 4, the numbers 1 and 2 and 6 and 7? What do all these commandments have in common? Any guesses? Or anybody want to cheat by looking at the next source? So our next source brings out this idea. The next source tells us, this is an English book actually it's the teachings of a Rabbi Uziel Milevsky, who was a teacher at Or Sameach. And he writes, first of all, the obligations to believe in God and to have no other God are the only 2 commandments the Jewish people heard directly from God himself. These first 2 commandments, which call for the absolute rejection of idolatry, are the cardinal ones and are the foundations for all the other 611 mitzvot. Belief in God is foundation to all the other commandments. Their correlation in interhuman relations, meaning on the other side, the value of human life, as reflected in the prohibition of murder, and fidelity, as reflected in the prohibition of illicit sexual activity, are therefore cardinal issues as well. And that fits very neatly into a concept that we have, which is demonstrated by this piece of Talmud. But the idea is that that when it comes to Jewish practice and the mitzvot, so human life always overrides a mitzvah, right? So if somebody's life is in danger, then we will violate the commandments. We'll violate Shabbat to save a life. All the mitzvah, human life always overrides the mitzvah. The Torah says, "V'chai bahem," and you should live by them. You should live by the mitzvah. You shouldn't die by the mitzvah. You don't give up a human life to observe a mitzvah, except for the three cardinal sins. That's what's described in the Talmud over here. With regard to all other transgressions in the Torah, if a person is told, transgress this prohibition and you will not be killed, he may transgress that prohibition and not be killed. In other words, or if somebody says, transgress this prohibition or be killed, you don't have to give up your life. You transgress the Torah's prohibitions, except for idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed, murder. Concerning those prohibitions, one must allow himself or herself to be killed rather than transgress them. So these are the three cardinal sins: are idolatry, forbidden sexual relations, and murder. You can't murder someone else to save your life. And what person has to give up their life for all those three? They are the cardinal sins. And so it makes sense in context of what we just said that actually they're not just the cardinal sins, but those are the commandments that we heard directly from God, in a sense. Because even though we only heard the first two, but the 6 and 7 actually correlate to those first two. So in a sense, we heard all three of the cardinal sins directly from God. I am the Lord your God, and don't have other gods besides for me. You shall not murder, and you shall not commit adultery. And with that would come other forbidden sexual activities, such as family or incest and things like that. The Torah prohibits other things also, but the first mentioned is the one that's actually mentioned in the Ten Commandments is adultery. So that's just an interesting pattern again that we have. Besides that, these correlate, but these are actually the three cardinal sins. Okay.
But Rabbi, they're talking about murder is not the same as necessarily killing in a conflict or something of that sort.
That's correct. A war would be different. Certainly to save. There's a concept in the Torah of a rodef. It means a chaser. If someone is being chased, then they're allowed to kill the person that's trying to kill them. So even though we say you can't kill someone to save your life, if that person is trying to take your life, then the Torah permits you to kill them. It's specifically if somebody says, like, the case that the Talmud actually speaks about is if somebody would say to you, kill so-and-so or I'll kill you, you're not allowed to kill so-and-so because that's murder of someone else to save your life. But somebody would be allowed to kill someone who's trying to kill them. And in general, a situation of war has its own laws, is different. Okay, now let's talk about the first commandment. That's what we're going to talk about primarily tonight. And it's not even really a commandment, it's a statement. The truth is, though, as I've mentioned a few times throughout the course, we call them the 10 Commandments, and the truth is the Torah actually calls them Aseret HaDvarim, the 10 things, the 10 statements. But we understand that they are mitzvot, or most understand, as we're about to discuss. So, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. That is counted as number 1 by many commentators. And Maimonides has a work where he lists what he believes to be the 613 mitzvot. The Talmud teaches us that there are 613 commandments in the Torah, and different commentators throughout our history have tried to list what they think. You can read through the Torah, you might be able to find more than 613 or less. So they have different rules for what counts and what doesn't count. So Rambam, Maimonides, has a list of what he thinks are the 613. And the first one that he lists is actually the first of the 10 commandments. And Rambam writes as follows. He says the first mitzvah on his list at least. It's not actually the first in the whole Torah, but the first is that we are commanded to believe in God's existence. The source of this commandment is God's statement, I am God your Lord, or the Lord your God. This translation, for some reason, switched the translations of Hashem and Elokecha. I am God your Lord. I am the Lord your God. I don't really know what the difference is, but I guess there could be a difference. But in the Hebrew, there's different meanings in Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am Hashem your God. Those have different meanings. But in the English, I guess people feel differently about what best translates as God and what best translates as your Lord. Anyways, we're not going to get into that now. The Rambam wants to prove that this is actually a commandment. How does he know that it's a commandment? It doesn't sound like a commandment, right? All it says is, oops, I'm going the wrong way. All it says is, I am the Lord your God. Is that a commandment? Doesn't sound like it. But Rambam says that I can prove it to you from the Talmud. The Talmud clearly understood that it's a commandment. Which piece of Talmud? So actually the piece of Talmud that we referred to a few minutes ago. And now we'll see it in a little bit more expansively. He says, the Talmud says as follows in Makos. It says 613 commandments were given to Moshe at Sinai. From which verse do we see this? Where can we see, how can we learn that 613 commandments were given at Sinai? So we have a tradition, but the Talmud is looking for like a hint in the Torah itself that that's the number. So you may remember this from when we did this previously. It says, Torah tziva lanu Moshe, the Torah which was commanded to us by Moshe. And the numerical value of the word Torah is 611. And if each letter has a numerical value, Taf is 400, Vav is 6, Resh is 200, and Hey is 5, for a total of 611. So the Gemara says, the Talmud says, well, I thought there's 613. Why is it saying that Moshe commanded us Torah 611? I thought there's 613. So finally, the Talmud says, like we said before, that the two commandments of I am the Lord your God, or I am God your Lord, and do not have any other gods, those were heard from God directly and not through Moshe, right? That's what we mentioned before. The first two were heard directly. So that's how you get 613. It says, Torah 611 were commanded to us by Moshe. Moshe transmitted them from God to us, and two of them were heard from God directly. That's what the Talmud taught, and that's what we mentioned before, that the first two were mentioned by God directly. But what do we see from that? Says the Rambam, says Maimonides, you see that those first two are both counted as part of the 613. It says, right? It says the first two, those two were out of the 613 came directly from God. So you see very clearly, it is clear from this passage that Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am God your Lord, or I am the Lord your God, meaning this mitzvah, a knowledge of God, is counted as one of the 613 mitzvot. That's how he proves it. That's what he calls the first mitzvah. Seemingly, right, he's saying this is where it starts. It starts with belief in God, which really begs the question. The question that we have to deal with tonight is, how can I be commanded to believe something? Either I believe it or I don't believe it. If I believe it, then wonderful. If I don't believe it, then I don't believe it. And what's commanding me to believe something going to change? I don't believe it. I'm sorry. You command me from today to tomorrow, but if I don't believe something, then I don't believe it. So how could the Torah make such a command? We've asked these types of questions before. Actually, for those of you who have been studying with me for a long time, we went through this question once on a Wednesday night at Links a while back. But we're going to ask the same question when we get to the 10th commandment, do not covet. How could the Torah command me not to covet? Either I do or I don't. It's a feeling, right? So here it's a similar question. It's a belief. Either I believe it or I don't. So how could the Torah expect me? And if I don't, then besides for that, I don't, but I'm also not inclined to try to go and believe it, because like why should I? I don't even believe that I don't even believe that there's a God that has a commandment. So there's nothing pushing me. Meaning, you might want to say, well, maybe it means that you have to try to believe in it. But if you don't believe in it, then what's going to kickstart you to try, because you don't believe in it in the first place? So it's a bit of a conundrum. So how do we understand that there could be a command to believe in God? The truth is that maybe partially for this reason, there are those who disagree with the Rambam and say that actually this is not a mitzvah. This is not one of the 613 commandments. There is no command in the Torah to believe in God. Why not? Because you can't command someone to believe in something. Either they do or they don't. But so what is it? After all, it says, I am the Lord your God. And it's expressing this idea of, believe in me, recognize me. So what it would be is, it's not in the sources. Okay, we don't have a slide for this, but what some say, they actually, Ramban, Nachmanides, who we've quoted before, he quotes this from an earlier work, who also counted up the mitzvot and didn't count this as one of them. It's a prerequisite to all of the mitzvot. Belief in God is the introduction to the 10 commandments because it's a prerequisite. Before you take on God's commandments, you have to first believe in God. But it's not a commandment. And perhaps the reason why it's not a commandment is because you can't really be commanded. But it's a prerequisite. And we are given the tools to arrive at it, to arrive at belief in God. And that's what we're going to talk about. What are those tools? Where would that belief stem from? And really, we can ask another question about this verse that says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. The first of the 10 commandments, according to Maimonides, it's a command, it's a mitzvah. And we're asking, how can you be commanded to believe in something? Well, let's ask another question. Why does God introduce himself? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. We could do better than that. How about, why not say, I am the Lord your God who created the world and created you? You want to show that if God wants to show that I own you, these are my commands. Let's do better than I took you out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God who created the world. I am the Lord your God who created you. Now here are my commands. Why shortchange himself by saying, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt? But really, this will help us answer the first question, or it will give us one approach to the first question. The Kuzari, who we've quoted before, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, he writes, we read this in week number 3, that the Kuzari is a recording of a discussion, or at least the author, most likely, I think, made up the discussion, but he wrote his work to answer basic questions about Judaism in a question and answer way, in a discussion with the king of the Khazars, and he introduces himself in the conversation as a Jew and a believer in the God who took the Jews out of Egypt. So the king of the Khazars asked him, well, why did you say that? Why didn't you say that you follow the God who created the world? Why same kind of question. So this is his response in the Kuzari, in that work. He said, God also revealed himself to the Jewish people at Sinai in the same manner. I didn't make this up. The reason I introduced God as the one who took us out of Egypt is not because it's not my own idea. I got it from God himself. That's how God introduced himself to us at Sinai. He said, I am the Lord your God who is taking you out of the land of Egypt. He did not introduce himself by saying, I am the Lord your God who created the world and yourselves. The fact that God took them out of Egypt was indisputable. And that's the key line. You know why God comes to the Jewish people at Sinai and says, I am the God who took you out of Egypt? Because that was something that they experienced. If he would have said, I am the God who created the world, they could have said, really? Like, prove it, right? I mean, God could have proven it, but But ultimately, for their relationship with God, for what they know of God, they were there in Egypt. They saw God's 10 plagues. They saw the miracles. They saw the miraculous. So where would indisputable faith come from for them? That's not from the fact that God created the world, because none of them were there. None of them were there to witness that. And nobody was there, in fact. Nobody was there when God created the world. So there's nobody to pass that on, or to give eyewitness testimony. So the fact that God took them out of Egypt, that was indisputable. That they had their own eyewitness testimony, and that is passed on to us generation after generation. So one of the main themes of Pesach, Passover, is building our emunah, building our faith in God. And the 10 plagues were meant to do just that. At the time, there were, amongst the Egyptians, Pharaoh himself said, "Who's this God of yours? Who's this guy you're talking about?" So God proved himself. God showed with the plagues, first of all, that he exists. Second of all, that he can get involved in the world. Some plagues went to the Egyptians and not to the Jews. You really, could split it up. That there's reward and punishment. God knows exactly what's going on in the world. So all of these beliefs are central to our belief in God, to the Jewish understanding of God, and we were witness to it. Our ancestors were witness to it in Egypt, with the witnessing the plagues, with the splitting of the sea, with the revelation at Sinai, and all of that is part of our long-standing tradition. So we did a class on the tradition and the strength of it and the reliability of it, and that itself is a source. The fact that we have a tradition of having witnessed God is itself a source for belief in God. So really, in a certain sense, God answers the question in that one line. God says, "I'm the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage." Well, how can you command us to believe in you? Well, because I brought you out of the land of Egypt. You witnessed to me. You witnessed my miracles. What's there to question? It's indisputable. And we nowadays have that very strong tradition of our ancestors witnessing that. That's a very, that's one source, strong source of faith for us as Jews. Now, one of the other medieval commentators, Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, I'm just going to get out of the share for a second because we don't need it for now. So Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra also deals with this question. Why does it say that I am the God who took you out of Egypt? And the Ibn Ezra tells us that there's different levels of belief or in faith in God. He says, many will believe in God because they heard about it. Somebody told them, believe in God. A higher level, he says, is they saw, it says in the Torah to believe in God, so they believed in God. But he says both of those levels of faith are not the strongest, let's just say. They're easily shaken. If somebody would come and an atheist would come and say, argue with them and debate them, they'll put their hand to their mouth because they won't have a response, because it's a very basic level of belief and not well founded. So he has actually the approach. His approach is that a person can develop a deeper appreciation for God through the study of science and looking at the world. So some people, science can move them in the opposite direction. They think that science, the more science that one learns, the less need for a God in the world, right? On the one hand, there were things that we never understood, and so traditionally people just said, "Oh, if I don't understand how it works, that's just God operating." And as people learn more about how the world operates, so then they said, "Oh, maybe we don't need this theory called God to explain all these things and how they work." But the truth is that for many, actually, the more they learn about science, the more they come to the realization of God. The greater appreciation, first of all, that you have for the complexity of the design of the earth, for the just absolute impossibility of all of the, if you really know about the the gravitational pull and the relationship of the planets and all these different fields. And I've looked into it before, but with science, like I read about something and then I forget about it like about a second later. But if you really study all of these things, so many great experts, scientists will actually come to a conclusion and say there's no way that this can exist without someone having designed it. It's impossible. All of these things that need to come together for the world to exist, it's like one in like billions and billions and billions that such a thing could happen randomly. And so actually looking at the world can bring one to a greater appreciation of the existence of a creator. Now, the Ibn Ezra in the writing in the 13th century or so was not talking about that. He was talking about more basic science, but as I mentioned before, sometimes like just look at the perfect cycles of the world of the water cycle and even just to look at an apple. I once gave a class that was titled, I think it was more about love of God from just looking at an apple, but you could look at an apple and really appreciate a designer in an apple. I have to see if I can recall all the cool things about just a simple apple. But first of all, an apple, when it first starts to grow, it's not like red or whatever color it's supposed to be. It's like a very green color or whatever. And it basically, the apple can tell us when it's ready to be picked, because the apple, because it's really, really smart, changes color when it's ready to be picked. And only then does it taste good. Before it's ready to be picked, it won't taste good. And so it will change its color to tell us that it's ready to be picked. Not only that, but it may even fall off the tree on its own to let us know. And the apple is actually really intelligent because it has seeds in it that are not edible, and it just happens to be that those seeds can be spit out and produce more apple trees, and it needs to be, the apples need to be eaten in order to be able to reproduce, to get those seeds to spread. So they taste sweet and people want to eat them. And you can really go on and on with basically anything in the world and look at it this way. There's much more to say about an apple. I don't really remember offhand. I wasn't actually planning to think. I didn't think to talk about it before, so I didn't look back at what I have about it. But it's true for many things in the world, that if you really look into them and appreciate the unbelievable design of them and how much it just makes so much sense, so that itself can bring a person to an appreciation of a creator. And that's another level of faith that the Ibn Ezra is describing. But again, he says, but not everybody can arrive at that. And so therefore the Torah tells us, the first commandment, I am the Lord your God. And if you can arrive at my belief on your own, then and a deep sense of belief on your own, then that's wonderful. But if not, Asher Otzeisicha me'eretz Mitzrayim, I'm the one who took you out of the land of Egypt, and that also is a source of faith in the tradition of having been taken out of the land of Egypt. So that's another idea. We can develop our faith through looking at the beautiful world that exists around us and science. And again, if not, there's always the fallback of the tradition. Now, by the way, I should just mention that there are those who sort of go the opposite direction and say, no, ultimately the best source of tradition, of faith in God, is actually tradition itself. We don't need to go exploring the idea on our own, the best way to have faith in God is just, to instill it. Obviously, we want to instill it within our children, and that's the best source, but not necessarily the searching and the seeking and arriving at on our own. Even better is just the passing it on through tradition. Ibn Ezra seems to be taking more to the side of exploration and understanding, and arriving at the conclusion through our own investigations as well as through tradition. So there's multiple paths here. We're going to talk about one more idea related to this, but before we do that, I want to just sort of give us a little, this is getting a little bit deeper, a little more philosophical. If we're talking about the commandment to believe in God, number one of the 10 commandments, well, how do we define God in Jewish thought? If I say God, well, we might have different ideas. The creator of the world, fine, but the one who controls the world, okay. But let's just read the first few paragraphs of Maimonides' Foundations of Torah, where he gives sort of a definition of what God is or is not. So here we go. So he says, the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of wisdom is to know that there is a primary being who brought into being all existence. So the most basic and first thing to understand is, well, he says that there's a primary being. That's the words he's using to describe God. What he means is something that existed before anything else. All the beings of the heavens, the earth, and what is between them came into existence only from the truth of his beings. There was one existence, God, and everything that exists came into existence from that original existence, that original God. And he says, if one would imagine that he does not exist, if this is like a thought experiment, if someone could imagine that God did not exist, then no other being could possibly exist, because everything that exists only exists as a result of God, emanates from God. And therefore, if one could imagine that God does not exist, that means nothing else could exist. If one would imagine that none of the entities aside from him exist, meaning if one would imagine that we don't exist, the world doesn't exist, the planets don't exist, the angels don't exist, the spiritual realms don't exist, if you could imagine that nothing exists except for him, well, he alone would continue to exist. And the fact that nullification of their existence, the fact that nothing else exists, would not nullify God's existence. Because all other entities require him, and he, blessed be he, does not require them, nor any one of them. Probably less redundant in the Hebrew, but the idea is that God's not dependent on anything else. Everything else could cease to exist, and God would continue to exist. And therefore, and this is a central line, the truth of his being does not resemble the truth of any of their beings. And what he means by that is what I put in parentheses here, is that his existence is absolute and ours is dependent. And this is a very deep concept, but it really gets to the core of what we believe God is, and that, there's various core central ideas, but one is that God's existence is absolute, meaning it can never cease and never, nothing, it's not dependent on anything. It's eternal. While everything that exists is just a result of him, is dependent on him. And so in a sense, it doesn't really exist in such an absolute sense. God is the only absolute truth, the only absolute existence. Everything else just exists as long as it's a whim still of God for everything to exist. If God ceases to desire existence to exist, then it would cease. It's dependent on God's whim. So at the very core, there's this major difference between God and anything else that exists, which is God is absolute, the original existence, and everything else is dependent on God. Now, okay, he brings verses that imply it. We're going to skip that for now. Let's see number 5. This entity, is the God of the world and the Lord of the entire earth. Okay. He controls the sphere with infinite and unbounded power. He controls the world. That's a central core belief in God, is that God controls the world and has infinite and unbounded power. This power continues without interruption because, and the way that one can know that this power still exists, he says, is that that the world is constantly revolving, and what is causing it to revolve? God is causing it to revolve. That one is he, blessed be he, who causes it to revolve without a hand or any other corporeal dimension. I mean, it's interesting that he focuses on the fact that the world revolves. You can focus on anything. The world exists. Anything exists. The fact that anything exists shows that God continues to breathe existence into it, and that and therefore that God's power continues without any interruption. So the knowledge, he concludes here, the knowledge of this concept is a positive commandment, as implied by our verse, I am God your Lord, or I am the Lord your God, the number one of the 10 commandments. So the Torah tells us, believe in God. Okay, I believe in God, but what is that belief? What am I supposed to believe? Or how do I understand what God is? So we can't really fully grasp it, but we can explore the idea and try to understand parts of it. I once heard that sometimes we can't really say what God is, but we could say what God isn't. God isn't like any person. We say God is not corporeal. He doesn't have a body. He's not physical in any way. But the Rambam Maimonides here is basically bringing out two important points. One is that God's existence is absolute. It pre-exists anything, everything that we see, everything that we experience, everything that exists is emanates from God, from God's desire for it to exist. It's dependent on God, and therefore it's not an absolute existence. And the only absolute existence is God. And the second central core idea that Maimonides points out is that God controls the world with infinite and unbounded power. There's other, I think, important facets to our belief in God, but these are a couple that he singles out. So just to conclude, okay, that's fine. I want to just wrap it up with one more idea about belief in God, and really going back to the question of how can the Torah command us to believe in something? Either we do or we don't. If one does believe in God, there's no need to command them to believe in God. And if one doesn't, then it's not in their control. They don't necessarily have an interest. Not only that, but the way the question is asked by one of the great sages, Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, is it seems a tall order, right? If we say that there's a mitzvah, there's a commandment, then that means that we expect that a Jew should be able to fulfill that commandment already. For a girl at the age of 12, a boy at the age of 13, right? At bar or bat mitzvah already, then they should be able to fulfill that commandment. And if some of the greatest minds of history struggled with belief in God, then how could the Torah expect from every person, and especially a young kid, to have the ability or the developed mind to believe like that? That's one of the ways that he sets up the question. And the way that he approaches the answer, so far what we've suggested is that the key lies in our tradition. The key may lie just in looking at the world. The way that Rabbi Wasserman approaches this question is, he says, the truth is that the existence of God should really be obvious to anybody and to everybody. And the fact that people struggle to believe in God is not really a problem in the intellect. but a problem that we all have, or that people have, with character and with midos. We had a very similar concept in our last course. It's basically, he develops an idea very similar to one that we saw there. But he makes the following argument. He says, he quotes, actually, I'll read to you from one of the great medieval works, the Chovos HaLevavos, Duties of the Heart. And he writes there, this is written probably in the 1300s. He says, there are some people who claim that the world came into being by chance, without a creator who created it and without a maker who formed it. It is amazing to me how a rational, healthy human being could entertain such a notion. If such a person heard someone else saying that the same thing about a water wheel, which turns to irrigate part of a field or a garden, saying that it came to be without a craftsman who designed it and toiled to assemble it and placed each part for a useful purpose, the hearer will be greatly amazed on him, consider him a complete fool, and be swift to call him a liar and reject his words. And since he would reject such a notion for a mere, simple, insignificant water wheel, which requires but little ingenuity and which rectifies but a small portion of the earth, how could he permit himself to entertain such a notion for the entire universe, which encompasses the earth and everything in it, and which exhibits a wisdom that no rational human intellect is capable of fathoming, and which is prepared for the benefit of the whole earth and everything on it? How could one claim that it came to be without purposeful intent and thought of a capable, wise being? It is evident to us that for things which come about without the intent of an intender, i.e. an intelligence, none of them will display any trace of wisdom or ability. Behold and see that if a man suddenly pours ink on a clean paper, it would be impossible for there to be drawn on it orderly writing and legible lines like it would be with a pen. If a man brought before us orderly writing from what cannot be written without use of a pen, and he would say that ink was spilled on paper and the form of the writing happened on its own, we would be quick to call him a liar to his face, for we would feel certain that it could not have happened without an intelligent person's intent. Basically, what the Chovos HaLevavos is writing 700 years ago or so is the idea that order doesn't just come from chaos, right? Chaos produces more chaos. Chaos doesn't produce order. And anyone who would look at the world and examine it, if you look at a watch, right? Nobody would say, you find a watch in the desert, nobody would say that it just, the minerals came together and formed this watch. No, somebody built it and left it there. And the same with the world, that you look at the world, it's so magnificent, so the design is so complex and beautiful that it's foolish to say anything other than that it was created by an intelligent creator. So that just intensifies the question, why then, how is it that there's so many people who don't actually believe in God or claim not to believe in God? And the answer, as I alluded to before, that Rabbi Wasserman gives, is it comes back to midos, comes back to our character traits. Just tell me which, are you seeing the front slide now, or you're seeing the screen? I can't tell which, okay, I'm gonna bring up there. Just wanna go to the last slide now. So we have a concept in the Torah of judges and bribery. You shall not take a bribe, for bribery blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts just words. A judge is not allowed to accept a bribe. No judge. Doesn't matter if he's Moses, he can't accept gifts. And the Talmud actually has a couple of stories. Shmuel, one of the sages of the Talmud, was once crossing a river on a ferry. A certain man came and gave him a hand to help him out of the ferry boat. He said to him, "What are you doing in this place?" The man said, "I have a case to present before you for judgment." Shmuel said, "I am disqualified from presiding over your case as you did me a favor." What favor did he do? He reached out to help him onto the ferry. Like, he basically held the door for him. If you can imagine a judge nowadays excluding himself, recusing himself from a case because one of the litigants held the door for him. That's basically what Shmuel said. And what the Talmud is teaching us is something very, very important, which is that Shmuel understood, and there's another story you could read, Meimar understood, that even the slightest favor, the slightest temptation can create a bias. And that's true in a judge judging a case, and it's true for anybody looking at the world. And if there are things in the world that we desire to experience, we want the freedom to be able to do whatever we want, to make our own decisions, not be bound by something so inconvenient as a God who has specific, a specific will for us. It's inconvenient, and there are temptations. So that, just like a bribe, a bribe blinds our will or blinds our judgment. So says Rabbi Wasserman, the same is true when it comes to belief in God. It should be obvious, it should be clear, but we're tempted by various things in the world. And that is where a person can be drawn astray from something obvious. It would seem so obvious,
Hey,
but yeah.
let me try to get this on my computer. Hold on.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. 1 second. So a person could be drawn astray from those those temptations. It's inconvenient, and ultimately that is one cause for people to not believe, because it again, even the sages recognized that a tiny benefit could impact their judgment. So things that affect our life on a grander scale, of course, that's going to affect our judgment. And that, according to Rabbi Wasserman, is that the foundations of belief will be obvious to a person with an ounce of intellect. It should be obvious so long as we are not being bribed by passions, by desires to look the other way. But that's something that we are consistently competing with, and it's to work on, and ultimately it comes back to working on our character, working on our midos, working on our virtues. And as long as we are not, as long as we are in control of ourselves, then we will be able to make better choices, make better judgment. And somebody who has clear thought and clear insight will ultimately arrive at what Rabbi Wasserman says is the obvious conclusion, which is the existence of God, fulfilling the first commandment of Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. All right, we will hold it there.
Thank you, Rabbi.